Oh, sorry about that. The hockey mask keeps the icicles off my face. So you're probably wondering what I'm doing dressed like a dunce this time of year. Well, there's Christmas in December, so I was thinking, why not Halloween in October? So without further tomfoolery, here's my review of Castlevania Legacy of Darkness for the Nintendo 64. And by the way, I'm not just grilling because it's a chilly October day outside. I forgot to pay my utility bill this month, so steak. I'm really cold right now.
So back in May, I reviewed Castlevania for the Nintendo 64, and if you haven't seen it, you'll probably want to watch that first. Links below. The review was well received, and I got some really good feedback from everyone. However, multiple people told me I had more or less missed the boat by reviewing Castlevania instead of Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. The sequel, well, more like the prequel. Well, really it's both, but I'll explain. A director's cut or special edition might be a more accurate description. In fact, it was originally going to be called Castlevania Special Edition before it was called Legacy of Darkness. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness is the game that the development team originally set out to make when they instead created Castlevania for Nintendo 64, and fortunately for Legacy of Darkness, and unfortunately for its predecessor, it shows. I've heard people say that Legacy of Darkness is essentially the same as the first one with a couple extra characters in it, but actually it's more than that. Legacy of Darkness contains not only the original characters Reinhardt and Carrie and their own storylines, but it also includes 2 new characters with 2 new storylines, well, more like 1.5. 8 possible endings, well, more like 6 and a couple minor alternates. Redesigned levels, new bosses, new music, expansion pack support, and some other much needed improvements. All of these additions and improvements basically render the first Castlevania game on Nintendo 64 pointless, since the game more or less contains the first game in it and improves on it in so many ways. It would pretty much be a complete waste of time to even talk about the first game after having played this one. Here's my review of Castlevania for the Nintendo 64.
Here's my review of Castlevania for the Nintendo 64. Here's my review of Castlevania for the Nintendo 64.
Oh. Right. Well, actually, you can't talk about Castlevania Legacy of Darkness without talking about Castlevania for the Nintendo 64, yet I didn't really mention Castlevania Legacy of Darkness in my review of Castlevania. I just kind of acknowledged its existence and moved on. Some of you pointed out that I really should play Legacy of Darkness, and several of you requested that I review it. I didn't really have time to talk about both games back in May because apparently there was no time at the time.
There's no time.
So I decided then that I would review Castlevania Legacy of Darkness for my Halloween video. Providing that there was time, of course.
No time.
In the meantime, I was able to go back and play through the first Castlevania on Nintendo 64 as Carrie, and check out the alternate endings and some other stuff I didn't have time for the first time around. Luckily now there is some time, so here it is, the end of the Castlevania on Nintendo 64 saga. I've already mentioned that Castlevania Legacy of Darkness was an improvement on the original, but how was it received? Well, just to review, Nintendo Power gave Castlevania on Nintendo 64 a 7.9, and Legacy of Darkness was released later the same year. Since this was an improvement on the original, surely it got a higher score, right? Nope, 7.2. Only 0.1 points higher than Toy Story 2 right next to it. Yeesh. Pretty much all of the reviews I read said that this game was at least an improvement on the original if nothing else, but most of them still scored Legacy of Darkness lower than the first one. What's up with that? Well, it's probably just a case of too little too late, but I'm getting ahead of myself now, so let's look at the game from the start. The game starts with a whole new intro and a completely different story. The primary story takes place 8 years prior to Reinhardt and Carrie's stories from the original game and follows Cornell, a man-beast with the ability to turn into a werewolf. Cornell is searching for his sister Ada, who is captured by Dracula's evil minions in an attempt to resurrect the Dark Lord. There is also new voice acting and cutscenes in this game, though the voice acting from the previous game was taken out because of space limitations. As I mentioned, there's new music in this game, and it's even better than the first one thanks to the new tracks. It also features some throwbacks like the Bloody Tears track from Castlevania 2 and the Stage 1 Ruins of Wallachia track from Castlevania 3. Speaking of the music, not only is there more of it, but it's also used more frequently, so there are far fewer silent sections than there were in the first game, though silence is used on occasion for dramatic effect. Whether music is playing or not, the sound effects are great. The graphics also look much better than they did in the first game thanks to the expansion pack optional support, which brings up the first pro-con I'd like to talk about. While the graphics look markedly improved with the expansion pack, unfortunately it's a double-edged sword because it also makes the frame rate clunk along like the most bogged down parts of the first game, but now more frequently and dramatically. The game runs pretty smoothly with the expansion pack turned from high res to low res, but of course, it looks kinda crappy. So take your pick, stunning and snail paced, or rapid and repulsive. Honestly, it doesn't look too bad in low res mode, and it certainly makes it more playable, but I played it in the high res mode for this review because it just looks better, and after a while I got used to the slowdown. Although the graphics are improved and some of the animations look really good, improvements weren't made in other areas. The biggest added feature of this game is that there are 2 new characters, each with their own story, moves, and special levels at points in the game. Actually, although he's a new character in this game, Cornell was originally going to be in the first game along with another character before they were pulled due to a lack of time. So with this new game, we've got the main character, Cornell, aka Blue Crescent, Reinhard Schneider, Carrie Fernandez, and Henry. Just Henry. Since I focused on Reinhard in my first review of Castlevania on Nintendo 64, I'll be focusing mainly on the other 3 characters for the purpose of this review. Now, when you start, Cornell is the only playable character, but you can see the other unlockable characters. Kind of annoying, but it definitely adds replay value, and it makes sense since Cornell's story takes place 8 years prior to Reinhard and Carrie's stories in the timeline, and Henry, well, I'll talk about him later. Once again, you can choose from 2 difficulties when you start, normal and easy. I'm not falling for that trap again, so I'll go with normal. I actually have no idea if this game lets you continue through the end on easy or not, but I'm not going to take a risk on wasting time this time. There's no time. From the start, you're treated not only to a new story and new character, but a new level, the Foggy Lake. I remember playing this ghost ship the one and only time I played this game back in the day before I decided that Legacy of Darkness was just more of the same and then forgot about it. At the time, I couldn't be bothered with this game since I was already burned by the first game because I felt the controls and camera were so horrid. Alright, let's see what improvements they made to this game. Well, while the camera views are the same, some of the camera problems were fixed and now you can move the camera around with the directional buttons, but I seldom found that useful to be honest. The camera makes adjustments on its own more quickly and more frequently and it just works better overall. Although some camera problems were fixed, more show up through sensitive directional controls and problems using the lock-on button. The other problem is that my old method of moving the camera by using the lock-on button doesn't work as well as it did in the previous game because the lock-on barely works, if at all sometimes, and it's pretty broken in this game. If you rely on the lock-on button, you could run into problems, especially when you're trying to face a specific direction or if multiple enemies are present. Yeah, they didn't fix that problem either. So while they improved the camera by making it tighter and track better, they busted the lock-on in the process. That's not quite a wash, but the broken lock-on doesn't help the camera one bit. So after you beat the first new level and first new boss, which is awesome by the way, you find yourself in the Forest of Silence. Again? We played this in the first game. Well, those improvements and changes were short-lived. Actually, some of the levels the Forest of Silence included have been redesigned. Some of the levels maintain the same design as the first game, but have been reimagined complete with new puzzles and events. So that's definitely an improvement. You'd think maybe the development team would have looked at the first game and thought, man, maybe 3D platforming isn't the best way to go, you know, cut down on that a bit. Wrong. Way wrong. On the contrary, you would think they were out to make Super Mario 64 or something with the amount of jumping and platforming they've actually added to this game. Luckily, most of the platforming and jumping is made more manageable by improved camera, lock-on troubles aside. While the controls are still the same, the platforming just feels smoother this time around. I made some pretty tricky jumps and saves while playing, but I also had my fair share and unfair share of plummeting to my doom. Part of the time because I dunced it, and part of the time because the camera or controls weren't exactly cooperating. If the Clock Tower was the first game's perfect storm of poor camera and awkward platforming controls, then this game's storm of the century would have to be the Tower of Ruins. It's the most awkward and frustrating platforming ever. Yes, I do believe it's worse than the Clock Tower in the first game, partly due to cheap tricks and traps, but I will say that the Clock Tower level in this game, while still quite challenging, is much improved. It looks like they took my first review to heart. Okay. This game is harder than the first one, and it has plenty of difficult platforming, owed in part to the design and in part to platforming control problems. Some of the platforming I actually enjoyed, like the platforming found in the new level, The Outer Wall, but throughout the game there were times that I just wanted to be done with a section so I could finally move on. Speaking of moving on, the pacing of each character's story is a bit uneven. Reinhard and Carrie's stories are just a bit longer than they were in the first game, which is fine, but Cornell's story is quite a bit longer. It has 3 more levels than the other 2 characters, and it begins to drag a bit, especially at the Tower of Ruins. On the other hand, Henry's quest is so short that it can be completed in less than half an hour. So Cornell's story drags a bit, but he's a cool character. He kinda looks like Bruce Lee and he even does similar moves. Whatcha? Whatcha? You can unlock some alternate costumes in this game, but man, are Cornell's puffy pirate pants ever puffy. I'm sure it was the style of the time and all, but they are just out there. Do these pants make me look fat? Yes, Cornell, they do. They make you look fat. Aww. His attack is probably the best in the game, and he can even turn into a werewolf. While you're a werewolf, your defense and attacks are increased, which is cool, but once you turn it on, you can't turn it off, and the whole time you're using up your jewel points. That means if you activate your wolf power, kiss all of your jewels goodbye. It isn't much of a problem though, because I rarely found this power to be very useful, except for on a few bosses. Speaking of the jewel points, they're still what fuels your throwing weapons, but in this game you can actually collect multiples of the same weapon to strengthen it. You can get doubles, or dualies, and triples just like in the old Castlevania games. That's a nice touch. Reinhardt and Carrie are pretty much the same as they were in the first game, save their alternate costumes, and some other nice touches. But the other main character besides Cornell has a very different storyline. In Cornell's storyline, you meet a boy named Henry in the garden maze. Yes, fighting the Frankenstein monster again sucks, but at least this time those two hellhounds aren't after you in Cornell's story. Anyway, you release Henry, and 8 years later in 1852, the same time that Reinhardt and Carrie's storyline takes place, Henry sets off on a rescue mission for the church to save 6 kids within 7 in-game days. For each kid you save, you will unlock something in the game such as hard mode, Reinhardt, Carrie, and alternate costumes. Okay, it sounds like it could be a good story, but no, it's just an Easter egg hunt, and most of the levels you've already seen by that point. Most of the kids are hidden pretty well, but whether you find the kids or not, the game is over in 7 in-game days, and if you whip out your Sun and Moon cards, you can crank out this story in no time. Of course you'll want to find all the kids in order to unlock all this stuff, but it isn't the hardest thing ever. Not only does saving the kids unlock features in the game, it also changes Henry's 3 possible endings, and let me tell you, they're pretty lame. Just like in the first game, Reinhardt and Carrie each have a good and bad ending, and Cornell only has one, but a good one. Henry, on the other hand, has 3 really weak possible endings. They're not even spoilers, really. Trust. If you don't rescue any kids, you don't rescue any kids. If you rescue 1 to 5 kids, well, you rescue 1 to 5 kids. But if you rescue all 6 kids, the morning sun lit up the strong, gentle features on Henry's beaming face. Huh? How could you tell? He's a completely faceless hero, and that's how his story feels. Faceless, forced, and completely tacked on. It was an interesting concept, but it wasn't fleshed out the way it could have been. Sorry, Henry. The connection with Cornell rescuing Henry and him coming back to save the kids was cool, but what's the connection with Reinhardt and Carrie since their stories are running concurrently? How did these kids get kidnapped and hidden in the castle in the first place, and what is this story's importance while Reinhardt and Carrie are saving the world? There's no explanation I found in the game or instruction booklet, and they could have tied it all together better. I don't know, maybe something like Henry is the first to arrive on the scene to save the kids, and he's the one that helps Reinhardt and Carrie gain access to the castle. Maybe he has to rescue the 6 kids to prevent Dracula from becoming even stronger, or just something. I feel like they could have given him a more compelling storyline in connection with the rest of the game. Playing only as Cornell from the start makes sense since his story takes place 8 years before Reinhardt and Carrie's, and I could even understand why they only let you play Henry next to unlock Reinhardt and Carrie if it made sense, but it doesn't. The general idea was good, but not working him into the timeline better was a missed opportunity. Speaking of timelines, the invention timeline is made much more ridiculous in this game since it takes place before the last game and there's much more advanced technology being used, especially in the Tower of Science. Sure, that was a problem in the first game, but the first game also didn't have modern machine gun wielding skeletons in the sidecar of a motorcycle. And now the prequel has modern machine guns? It's poppycock. But it's a video game, so pass. Another fine piece of poppycock is the cryptic messages used for puzzles. Yes, once again you're waiting around in the rose garden for a key to show up, but at times it gets more convoluted than that even. Some things just aren't explained as well as they could be in this game. For example, when you're trying to rescue Henry in the garden maze, a tutorial tells you all about not leaving Henry behind and going back to get him, but he's so slow and it's really annoying. I kept him at a reasonable distance, but it took me forever to find out that you can't enter a door without him unless he's right by you. It took me way too long to figure that out, no thanks to the tutorial. Alright, it's probably partly my fault, but it could have been explained much better. Not all of the difficulty in this game is thanks to problems with the vague puzzles, controls, or camera. Some of this game is just genuinely difficult on its own, like some of the new bosses for example. There's even a new, totally different final battle with Dracula when you play as Cornell, and it's awesome. Overall, I think this game is a lot more challenging and much improved from the original because of the improvements to the gameplay, camera, and added features, but you wouldn't know that from reading the reviews. I can't help but wonder what the reception of this game would have been had it not been preceded by Castlevania on Nintendo 64. I believe that Legacy of Darkness is a much more complete and improved game whose reputation was marred by its predecessor. It's a shame that the creators didn't hold off and release the game they originally envisioned instead of a good one and a somewhat subpar but still pretty good one. Now, that's certainly not to say that the successor fixed all of the problems of its predecessor, because it simply didn't, but if given a choice of which game to pick up, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness wins hands down, though hardcore fans may want to own both in order to experience the level variations between the two versions. Sure, there's things to dislike about this game, but for me, there's more to like than dislike about it. Is it the best Castlevania game ever made? Absolutely not. Is it the worst Castlevania game ever made? Not a chance. All in all, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness is a decent Castlevania game, and a good game for the Nintendo 64.